Distinguished colleagues and friends, a good afternoon and a very warm welcome to the David J. Bederman Lecture. It's a joy to see all of you here and to have so many more joining us online. My name is John Whitty. I serve as a law professor here and faculty director of our Law and Religion Center. I'm standing in for our illustrious dean, Marianne Babinski, who is convalescing at home. She sends her deep regrets at not being here. Her warm congratulations to our distinguished speaker and her warm greetings to all of you. This lecture series was established in honor of our late, great friend and brother and colleague, Professor David J. Bederman, the Geer Professor of International Law. David was a prodigious scholar with some 12 books and 125 articles to his name. He was a master teacher, reaching some 4,500 Emory law students in 20 years and courses in international law, admiralty law, Roman law, and other topics. And he was a brilliant legal advocate. Counsel of record in 52 federal cases, 4 before the United States Supreme Court, all wins for his client. But most important, David was our beloved friend and colleague. And his untimely death in 2011, after protracted illness at the mere age of 50, broke our hearts. His bride, Lori Cuzzy, and his daughter, Annalise Bederman, helped us to overcome our grief by generously creating the David J. Bederman Fund. And that allowed faculty and students and staff and alumni and others to contribute in David's memory, to do something tangible to channel our grief. And the fund grew swiftly in testament to our love for David and for Lori and for Annalise. And that fund now supports a David Bederman research scholar on the Emory Law School faculty. It supports a series of student fellowships at the Hague Academy of International Law, where David spent a good bit of his time, and it supports this distinguished lectureship. Lori Cuzzy is with us, and I hope you will join me in a robust round of applause in affection and appreciation to her and in memory of our great friend, David Bederman. I'm glad you're in a clapping mood because we have so much to applaud in this year's Bederman Lecturer. In earlier years, we welcomed great international luminaries to this lectern, including Judge Burkett and Justice Abella and Chief Prosecutor Bensouda and President Jimmy Carter. But these were mere warm-up acts to our wonderful speaker today, Professor Kim Lane Scheppele. She is the Lawrence Rockefeller Professor of Sociology and International Affairs at Princeton University. Her work focuses on the intersection of constitutional law and international law, particularly in constitutional systems that are under stress or distress. After the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, Professor Scheppele studied the emergence of constitutional law in Hungary and Russia, living in both places for extended periods. After 9/11, she researched the effects of the international war on terror on constitutional protections around the world. Since 2010, she has been documenting the rise of what she calls autocratic legalism in Hungary and Poland and other former Soviet bloc countries within the EU, as well as closer to home, including in our own world. Her many publications in law reviews and social science journals and hefty monographs come out in multiple languages and have taken up these and other topics. Professor Scheppele is an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the International Academy of Comparative Law. In 2014, she received the Law and Society's coveted Kelvin Prize for her influential scholarship. Before joining the Princeton faculty, she held distinguished professorships in sociology and political science at the University of Michigan, the University of Pennsylvania. She was the founding director of the gender program at Central European University in Budapest, and has held visiting law faculty positions in Michigan, Yale, Harvard, Rotterdam, and Berlin. Professor Scheppele is precisely the kind of international legal rock star that we welcome to the David Bederman Lecture, and she comes to us to enlighten us on a most intriguing and I dare say troubling topic: destroying democracy by law. Please join me in welcoming this year's David Bederman Lecture, Professor Kim Lane Scheppele.
Oh my goodness, thank you so much. And embarrassing introduction, but I'm so glad to be here and so glad to be here in honor of such a distinguished scholar and at a university where I'm so thrilled to call so many of the faculty and students friends. And I've learned a lot about your international program, international commitments, and I know that that was one of David Bederman's great legacies here, and I'm so glad to see so many people carrying this on. So let me start with some slides. My topic today, destroying democracy by law, is not a really subtle topic, but unfortunately, it's something that we're now seeing. Let's see, clicker there, around the world. So what we're seeing, what we've been seeing now for about 15 years, is that democracy is in decline. And this is measured by, all of the democracy rating agencies, so to speak, from Freedom House to the Varieties of Democracy Project in Stockholm, to the Economist Intelligence Unit. Pretty much everybody who's measuring the health of democracies around the world has said that democracies that used to be robust are now weaker. Some weak democracies have tipped over into autocracies, and even autocracies are getting worse. And this is a chart that shows you democracies in blue and autocracies in red. But one of the things I hope to convince you of by the end of the lecture today is that it's becoming harder and harder to figure out which color a country is. There are a lot of purples, which is to say a lot of countries that masquerade as democracies that have had their democracies hollowed out from the inside, and that it's really important to be able to recognize when that's the case. So let me give you a little bit of an introduction to where this is happening. This looks like your typical social science chart, like, oh my goodness, no. But this is actually easier to read than you think. So this is the Varieties of Democracy Project Liberal Democracy Score, in which they look at things like checks and balances, separation of powers, judicial independence, as well as respect for rights, all kind of put into a single index. And the country scores on this index for 2009 are along the bottom, and for 2019 are along the side. Here's the easy part. If a country didn't change in those 10 years, they're still on the line. If they got better, they're above the line. Okay, this is 2019, so a couple of them, like, I wouldn't put Tunisia above the line right now, but still, the countries above the line got better during that decade. The countries below the line got worse. And what you'll see is that there's a lot of countries below the line. And what's striking is that the distance from the line a country is tells you how much worse they got in those 10 years. And so I'm writing a book called Destroying Democracy by Law, because I've been looking at a lot of these countries below the line and trying to figure out, like, how did they get there? In particular, the ones that are kind of on the top half of the democracy scores, like, how did countries that we thought of as robust democracies really begin to fail? And it turns out that they have failed in ways that were invisible to a lot of people. So it used to be the case that when democracies fell, you knew it, tanks in the street, somber music on the radio, all those kinds of things. Coups were the dominant ways that democracy failed. What this is a chart that shows you is that sort of colored in gray. I was told you might be able to see the cursor. Yeah, good. So this part that's colored in gray, during the Cold War, the dominant way that democracies failed was by coup. The grays are the attempts, the red are the successful coups. This is just raw numbers. And what's interesting is that between the time this chart starts in 1950 and the time the chart ends in 2016, the number of countries in the world doubled, so if it's happening at the same rate, you should see the number going up, but the number goes way down, especially at the end of the Cold War. And since the end of the Cold War, we've seen relatively few coups in the world. That's not how democracies are failing. So how do they fail? Well, again, the Varieties of Democracy folks did a study. They sort of coded all these cases in which there were major extensions of executive power. Because one of the main differences between democracies and autocracies is that an autocracy's power tends to be very heavily concentrated in a very powerful executive with no checks. So they were studying that process. And it turns out that since 1970, they've found that 70% of all the major extensions of executive power were accomplished through law. And in half of those cases, the law wasn't even changed. It was through a reinterpretation of existing law. And that's one of the reasons why this democracy decline wasn't really sort of discovered until it was already far along. Because what's happening now is that the way democracies die is not by tanks in the streets, but by teams of lawyers coming in, rewriting the law, reinterpreting the law, all the while maintaining the superficial appearance of a democratic government. So it's extremely hard to tell if you're just looking at a government from the outside, how healthy is it? And so you have to kind of get beneath the surface. So today I'm going to talk about 4 countries. I actually picked the 4 this morning. I had lots of slides of lots of countries, but I'm going to talk to you about 4. So I'm going to talk to you about Vladimir Putin's Russia, because people forget that it was once a country that we thought could be a democracy, and also because it's causing so much trouble now. I'm going to talk to you about Viktor Orban's Hungary. Like I said, I've lived and worked in Hungary and Russia, so I saw those cases really from the inside. I'll talk to you about Jair Bolsonaro, who just had a, shall we say, a January 6th moment on January 8th in Brasilia, in Brazil. And then also, because we're in the US, I'll talk to you about Donald Trump. So those are going to be my 4 cases. And here's what to look for. So it turns out that the way that these constitutional autocrats, as I'm calling them, or legalistic autocrats, or autocratic legalists, what happens is that they follow a certain script. Okay, now they don't have to do things exactly in this order. They don't have to do things, as I'll show you, there's a slow version, a fast version, but these are the things that they do, right? So they all come to power through elections, usually free and fair elections the first time, okay? And so the question is, how do election systems allow them to win if they have these autocratic aspirations? One question I want to deal with a little bit today. Then when they're in power, all of their moves are aimed at dismantling checks on executive power. And that how they do that depends on the system, like what are the checks in that system? So this is why you sometimes see the same moves being made country to country, but sometimes not, because it really depends on how the checks are organized. They also want to capture the parliament or make it irrelevant. So they might change the rules for electing the parliament. They might actually make the parliament an optional feature of lawmaking. Happens in some places. So neutralizing the parliament is crucial. Capturing the courts is crucial, particularly the court that can tell them that what they're doing is unconstitutional if they haven't yet changed the Constitution. So capturing the Constitutional Court, the peak court, is actually quite crucial through reform, through new appointments. Then, of course, these autocrats have to ensure that their loyalists are in key positions. So capturing the public prosecutor's office is crucial. Tax enforcement, because you can harass your opponents into submission. The judicial selection authority, because capturing the courts is really crucial, and picking the people who pick the judges is crucial. And then election administration, because by the time the autocrat comes up for election the second time, they want to be able to control how those elections work. Harnessing the media as an echo chamber, making sure that the media are as often as possible repeating the official state line is something, again, crucial to this autocratic consolidation. Harassing the civil sector, so the NGOs, the whole kind of, the real grassroots organizations that might object, as well as opposition political parties, so harassing them into submission. And then what's crucial is rewriting the election laws so that by the time the autocrat comes up for re-election, the outcome of the election has been determined already by the way the rules are written. So that's the script And we'll see that it's accomplished in a lot of different ways. But if you know that's the thing, these are the danger signals, then you know what to look for. So I'm going to walk you through 3 different ways this can be done, 3 different ways those particular, elements can be accomplished. So I'll talk to you about what I call slow autocracy, and I'm going to give you an example of Russia under Putin. Until this morning, I had my slides on Turkey under Erdogan, so I have slides if you want. Then there's what I call the Blitz model. The autocrat gets elected and a whole bunch of things change all at once. I'll talk to you about Viktor Orban's Hungary, but I could have talked to you about, Venezuela under Hugo Chavez. Sometimes I do Hugo Chavez just to give you a left-wing example, so I'm not just picking on right-wing autocrats. So he's there. And then there's a model that I call, with my co-author David Posen, something we've decided we call executive underreach, which is where a president comes into office and just decides to kind of destroy everything, and basically not do their job, just let things fall to the floor, and that's another model. And I'll talk to you about Brazil under Bolsonaro. And then I'll come to the US. And what's interesting about the US dilemmas now with democracy is that it has elements of all 3 of these things. It's kind of a real hybrid case among these 3 models. And the US, I think right now, is really hovering on the edge between autocracy and democracy. Cheerful, right? Okay, so let's start with Russia. And Russia, I think, is an interesting case because when Vladimir Putin came to power on New Year's Eve, 1999, at the start of the millennium, what people usually say is Boris Yeltsin, who had governed really in chaos through the 90s. Boris Yeltsin hated law. He governed by executive decree. If you ask judges what life was like in the 1990s, they would all say, oh, we have our shoeboxes. Shoeboxes, what's that? The shoebox is where you put in the executive orders, what was law today, what somebody else told you was law. I mean, literally there was no codified law in Russia through the 1990s. It was really chaotic. And Yeltsin was drunk much of the time, some of you may recall. So when Yeltsin finally resigned on New Year's Eve, the story goes, oh, he handed off to his loyalist Putin, the KGB guy. I want to convince you that's not quite the right frame to think about Russia. So what happens? Yeltsin resigned. Under the Russian constitution at that time, the prime minister takes over as acting president. This is how Putin becomes president. He was the prime minister at the time. The constitution says, and then an election must be held within 3 months of the handoff. That's what happened. There was an election on the 26th of March, 2000. That election was the freest and fairest election Russia's ever had. There were 12 candidates on the ballot. In that competition, Putin got 53% of the vote. No trouble signals yet. All right. And at first, and this is when I was living and working at the Constitutional Court there, Putin was the good guy. He was the lawyer. He came in and he worked with the parliament to finally pass a new civil code, a new criminal code, a new criminal procedure code, a new land law. Every day there were these framework statutes coming out of the parliament. And finally, so I was working at the Constitutional Court, the judges said, for the first time, we know what the law is. I mean, he really seemed like a good guy. When 9/11 happened, Putin was the first guy to call the US president at the time, George Bush, to say, we understand all about terrorism. We fought a war in Afghanistan too. And we will give you overflight rights, the use of military bases. I mean, he was really on board with the war on terror. And he had honored the law, and in particular, international law, where Yeltsin had not. So what happened? Well, Russia had a whole series of terrorist attacks. There was a big terrorist attack in the center of Moscow in November of 2002, where some Chechen terrorists came in and took 900 audience members hostage for several days. The entire thing was on television. The rescue of those hostages killed at least 130 of them. And the Russian government got, shall we say, not great ratings for how its security services managed the rescue. There were a whole bunch of other terrorist attacks, bombs on the Moscow metro, attacks in the surrounding countryside. And then there was this attack in Beslan. It was the first day of school when parents show up with their kids to give flowers to their teachers. Everybody dresses up. It's a major occasion in Russia. And here too, Chechen terrorists stormed the school, held, more than 1,000 people hostage. And in the rescue, 333 people died, including 186 children. And that was a turning point. You know, the terrorism really had to stop. And so Putin came in saying, look, what we have to do is increase what the Russians call the vertical of power, meaning the president has to be able to control more stuff, because he had been giving orders to the regional governor who hadn't been doing anything in Beslan in North Ossetia. And so he said, you know, we need to change the law. From now on, the regional governors, so that Russia was it still is nominal, at least a federal system. So the governors of the states had been elected, but many of them were still the old Communist Party leaders, you know, from the Soviet time. He said, we're going to get rid of all of them and I will appoint governors. He's cheered on by this. Turns out what happens when you appoint the governors is that the Russian Constitution was a copy of the US, more a copy of the US than almost any other constitution in the world written at that time. There's an upper chamber of the parliament in which every state gets 2 senators. And who picks the senators? Well, it's like the original US Constitution. It was the state governors and legislatures that picked the senators. So by naming the governors, Putin got basically his people in naming the Federation Council, naming the senators. He also changed the law to change the way elections were run, so that instead of having, instead of having just a representative from your district, you know, like we vote for the House of Representatives here, he said, look, everybody has to run for election on a party list, no more of these independents, because the parliament was full of lots of free agents who were not, it was hard to negotiate with the parliament. He said, we need a more organized parliament. Everybody has to run on a national party ticket where the party has representation in at least 60 of the 89 at that time jurisdictions. Makes perfect sense. What happened though, was that almost all of Putin's critics were these independent MPs who did not have a party to stand on. So by changing the election rules, it meant that he guaranteed more or less that his party, which was the only really organized party apart from the old Communist Party, would win. Now, actually what this little chart shows you, on the right up there, is that throughout this period, you know, if you ask people, do you have confidence in Putin? This goes from 2003 to 2017. You know, confidence in Putin increases, but he always has at least 3/4 of the public behind him, right? So he's genuinely popular. And what happens when he finishes all these reforms? The next election for the parliament, blue is the Putin party. Green is a funny party. Putin was criticized for not having an opposition party. So he said, okay, fine, I'll invent one. So that's the Putin opposition party, which deviates from United Russia in a few matters, but they're basically pro-Putin. They're just, against certain things. So the blue and the green together are Putin's people. Yellow are all the people quoted in the US press as the liberals who speak English and want universal values in Russia. And then red are the old communists. So basically Putin's gambit won. He had captured the Federation Council through the governors. He captured the lower house of parliament through the Duma. And the percentage of Putin's seats in the parliament goes up to 63%. Okay, so then Putin's got this problem. Under the Russian Constitution, as Yeltsin had designed it, copy of the US, term limits, 2 4-year terms is all the president can handle. Okay, and that's all you can do, can't run again. So by 2008, actually in the run up to 2008, Putin realizes he's got this problem on his hands. He's going to hit the term limit. And this is where you start to see, this is really, if you were in doubt before, this is the autocratic switch flip. It turns out in the presidential administration, which is this huge sprawling bureaucracy that reports up to the president, he instructed them, and this is actually when I was working at the court, so I got to see a draft of this. He instructed them, think about what happens if we switch Russia from being a presidential system, where term limits are kind of normal, to being a parliamentary system where you never find term limits, right? Angela Merkel was in power 16 years. Margaret Thatcher was in power 11 years. Why don't we complain about that? Because they are the leaders of their parties and their parties keep getting reelected, right? So Putin says, well, as long as I've got the parliament, why don't we switch Russia to a parliamentary system? Okay. I just want you to think about the legal engineering here, right? Putin's a lawyer. His whole circle are lawyers. They've always been lawyers. What I always say is they may have been in the KGB, but they were the KGB's lawyers. Think of them as being like the people who go through the Justice Department honors system, honors program. They were the best of the best who went in that route. And those were the people that Putin brought into his system. So they never actually engineered this plan. I think they thought it was a bridge too far. So what they did was they arranged what I've called the Great Swap. And some of you will remember this. This is where Vladimir Putin and his loyal prime minister decide to switch places, right? So Putin then comes out in support of Dmitry Medvedev, also a lawyer, by the way. Dmitry Medvedev had been the primary author of the first Russian civil code in 1993. He was head of the law department at St. Petersburg State University. Okay. And Medvedev then agrees to run for president. He then agrees to appoint Putin as his prime minister. And during the time that Dmitry Medvedev is president, he presides over the amendment of the Russian Constitution to extend the presidential term of office to 6 years from 4, formal constitutional amendment, and to say that because the Constitution is amended, we go back to 0. Like whoever has served before, it's 2 consecutive terms, so Putin could run again. So by the time the 4 years is over of Medvedev's term, Putin has 12 years of clear sailing ahead of him. All legal, all hyper legal, in fact. And so what happens? He gets 8 more years, or he gets 12 years. The 12-year term ends in 2024. So where are we now? Well, we're very close to that. So Putin thinks ahead. How am I going to extend the term limits? So he brings on board this package of constitutional amendments in 2020, which actually amends 206 different aspects of the Constitution. It's 60 pages of legalese, right? And he springs this on the parliament, and a lot of it is, reforms of all kinds. And then it turns out one of the deputies in the Duma, in the lower house of the parliament, an 83-year-old woman cosmonaut, who is a great hero of the Russian Federation, comes up and says, I want to amend one of these amendments. And I think we should reset the presidential term to 0. And the Duma stands up and applauds, and they all vote for the amendment to the amendment. In other words, the term limit extension doesn't come out of Putin's shop directly, right? It comes from the Duma. As you've seen, the Duma is now a cheering squad for Putin, so it goes through this whole process. And then Putin says, that's not enough, I want a referendum. So they have a referendum, 68% turnout, 78% vote for the constitutional amendment package. Now, why do they do this? I mean, why do they keep voting this guy? Well, because hardly anybody mentioned the 0 reset. Instead, it was all culture wars. So what do the constitutional amendments do? They mention God in the Constitution for the first time. They uphold and they advocate now Christian principles as the basic principles of the Russian state. They ban gay marriage. They make Russian the official language. All of this is, in a country that really is falling in the international, shall we say, grand scheme of things, it was bolstering the Russian nationalists, and they overwhelmingly vote for it. The 0 reset was hardly ever mentioned in the public debate. And there was hardly any opposition. The opposition couldn't agree. In fact, the amendments strengthened the Duma a little bit relative to the presidency. So it's not completely, putting all the power into Putin's hands, but the 0 reset means he can now be president until 2036. Okay. And of course, then Russia invades Ukraine. And there's a wonderful paper by a legal scholar at the University of Tennessee called Robert Blitt, in which he argues, and I must say, it's a brilliant argument. He said, look, if you had read those constitutional amendments closely, you would see the war coming. Why? Because the Constitution puts the Russian Constitution above international law. Duh, that's what we do in the US, right? How can we criticize it? But before, it had been flipped, and so Putin flips it. So, and it's not just the Court of Human Rights in Europe, which is what they were having trouble with, but it's the law of war in time. I mean, it's all international law is now subordinate to the Russian Constitution. And so what does the Russian Constitution say? It prohibits any part of Russian territory from being alienated, which means if some international agreement comes up with the bright idea that Russia has to give back Crimea, it is unconstitutional in Russian law now to do that. And moreover, the Constitution now obligates Russia to, quote, defend compatriots. Russians anywhere in the world must be defended by the Russian state. All of those were used as arguments when Putin went into Ukraine. And I think if we paid closer attention to the amendments, we would have seen it. Now, why do I say that? Well, nobody thinks Russia's a democracy anymore, but everything Putin has done has been legal. And in fact, if you pay a lot of attention to what he does legally, you're going to know what he's going to do next. And so, these legalistic autocrats at least tip you off. if you're paying attention. But still, Russia went from having what looked like a democracy to something that no one mistakes for a democracy anymore. All right, so that's the slow version, because it took a while for all these constitutional amendments to build up this absolute power for Putin. Let's go to a faster transition, and that is Mr. Orban in Hungary, who has famously turned Hungary into what he calls an illiberal state, by which he means there are no liberals in the government, which is not what he meant when he really said it. But anyway, this is now the view. Now, how did Orban come to power? Again, free and fair election, absolutely free and fair the first time. It turns out that when Hungary went through the transition when the Cold War ended, Hungary had a fatal combination. Didn't look fatal at the time. One was that when they were designing their election law for the 1990 elections, this is when there hadn't been any free and fair elections in Hungary since right after the Second World War, and then only briefly. Nobody knew how any party would do. And in fact, the worry was that they were going to have a million little parties. So they designed an election law that was highly disproportionate, that sort of put its thumb on the scale of whichever party got the most votes to tip it over into being able to form a majority government. That was how the law was written in 1990. And at the same time, when Hungary was the first of the post-communist states to get a new constitution. In fact, Hungary got its new constitution 2 weeks before the fall of the Berlin Wall. And that new constitution, because they wrote it in a hurry, they knew they might have to amend it. So they had a very easy amendment rule. A single 2/3 vote of the unicameral parliament can change anything in the Constitution. So it turns out in 2010, for a variety of reasons, the party system was basically a 2.5 party system, or 2.5 1/4. There was the Socialist Party, on whose watch the economy had just collapsed. There was the neo-Nazi party, Jobbik. There was a little tiny liberal party that consisted of, I always say, it's kind of a little green, a little young, but mostly like uncertain what it was standing for. And then there was Orban's party. And when Orban won, he won 53% of the vote. A lot of us were relieved that the neo-Nazi party only got 17%. Actually, that was the real competition. But in this system where the election law sticks its thumb on the scale of plurality parties, the 53% of the vote turned into 68% of the seats in the parliament. That orange C up there, sorry, it's in Hungarian, but that orange C are the seats that were occupied by Orban's party after the free and fair 2010 election where all the choices were bad, right? So with his 68% majority, Orban says, this is a revolution of the ballot box. And if you can change anything about the Constitution, why not? Why not have a totally new constitution? In fact, again, like Putin, Orban's a lawyer. His whole inner circle are all lawyers. And one of the ways that you could tell you were in trouble was that within a few weeks of taking office, there was one clause in the Constitution that said, if you're going to write a new constitution, you need 3/4 of the parliament to approve it. He takes his 2/3, he amends the 3/4 clause out, and you knew that's where he was going, right? So within a year, his team comes up with a brand new constitution. To this day, nobody knows exactly who wrote it. There was no public discussion. There was no opposition input. It's sprung on the parliament. They have a couple of days of debate. None of the opposition amendments get through. In fact, the opposition is barely allowed to speak, and it passes on a party line vote in 1 year. And what it does is it basically rewrites not only the sort of constitutional framework of the country, but it requires the rewriting of virtually all law. Okay, now, what you could have seen as this was going along was that the Constitutional Court, which was very powerful in Hungary, might have said no, might have said you can't amend the 3/4 with the 2/3. It might have said, okay. So while the constitutional process is going on, Orban starts capturing the Constitutional Court. So he does it by changing the system for appointing judges. You used to need a majority of the parties in the parliament followed by a 2/3 vote of the parliament to elect a judge. He drops the first stage. A little technical, but he's got 2/3, so he can elect any judges. So then he says, well, we're going to increase the jurisdiction of the Constitutional Court, so it will get many more human rights cases. We need to improve the number of judges, so we're going to go from 11 to 15. He gets those 4. Then he changes the jurisdiction of the court to get it out of his way on budget stuff. And then the court is still, while it's being packed, ruling that one law after another that Orban's parliament is passing is unconstitutional. So Orban saves up all those unconstitutional laws, and then just as he captures 8 out of the 15 judges, he passes this massive constitutional amendment that puts into the Constitution all the laws the court had declared unconstitutional. And with the amendment, it says, and the court may not rule on the constitutionality of a constitutional amendment. By 2013, it was all over. Okay, fast, this was all fast. The Constitution then required what were called Cardinal Laws, általános törvény in Hungarian, and it means laws that require a 2/3 vote of the parliament to pass, so they're almost as entrenched as the Constitution. And actually, a lot of the dirty work was not done in the Constitution itself. Like Orban knew there'd be a lot of international oversight of this process, and so he didn't put the worst stuff into the Constitution. The Constitution would say, here's a provision, and the details shall be provided by law. Those laws were these so-called cardinal laws, and that's where all the devil is in the details, so to speak. There were 50 plus cardinal laws required. They zipped through Orban's parliament. This is just some of the topics. There were thousands of pages of laws going through the parliament all at once. I mean, the members of parliament had no idea what they were passing. And the question was, how did they write so many thousands of pages? The answer was, while Orban had been out of power, he'd been prime minister once before, he was out of power between 2002, 2010. His party hired a lot of little law firms to write all these laws. But the point of hiring a lot of little law firms was that no one saw the whole. Everyone just had their little piece to work on. But there was a jigsaw puzzle master at the center that was figuring out how all these things would go together. And so as soon as he gets into office, they start shoveling these things through the parliament. I interviewed some of the MPs who actually were, introducing the laws. I said, what's in it? They had no idea. It was just all passed by this rubber stamp parliament. So there's one on the judiciary. So how did they capture, like the Constitutional Court is a separate court. Otherwise, the judiciary is like many judiciaries in the world where you go to law school, you decide you want to be a judge, you graduate, you become a baby judge, then you get promoted. It's like a civil service career. So how did they capture that? Well, if it's a civil service progression, the senior most judges are all older. So they lowered the judicial retirement age overnight, got rid of the top 15% of the judiciary. At the same time, they changed the system for appointing judges. They put this woman in charge. By the way, her husband was the one who wrote the Constitution, as far as we can tell. But she personally just picked all the judges, put them into their particular position. And then, as this judicial reform went on, they now have a system where the judge, the chief judge of every court can assign any case to any judge. So they didn't need to capture all the judiciary. They just needed to put enough friendly judges on every court and to capture all the court presidencies, which were all those senior judges they got rid of at the beginning, so that anytime a case comes up that the government cares about, they can get it to a judge who will make the decision they want. So they've captured the judiciary. I could go through a lot of other things, the way they've made the parliament to a rubber stamp. They captured all of the independent authorities. That's too much detail. The crucial thing, though, is that Orban changed the election laws so that he has never lost an election since. And I wrote a big article. If you want to see the detail, the Journal of Democracy published an article by me in July detailing how all that works so that Orban never loses. And moreover, he's kept his 2/3 parliamentary majority so that you have, I lost count. I had to go back and look. The 12th Amendment to this Constitution that's only 10 years old was just passed in the fall. Literally, they can wake up in the morning and decide, oh, we should change the Constitution, and by night it's changed. Literally they are above the law. Okay, so they're still in the EU. I should just say Orban is above the law. This is a complete autocracy, but it looks, if you go there on vacation, it will look like a robust democracy. It doesn't have the signature elements. It's not like going to Russia where you feel it. In Hungary, you don't. All right. Let me give you one more example, and then I'm going to get to the US. This is a shorter example because there's less to say about it. But there's an example of what I call executive underreach. What happens if you get an aspirational autocrat, somebody who wants to stay in power forever? He just doesn't want to do the job. Okay. And this guy was like that. Okay, so this is Jair Bolsonaro. You might have seen him recently. He's been in a hospital in Florida lately, but he was president of Brazil for 4 years. He came to power in a 2018 election, which very much like the election that brought Trump to power, featured, I mean, he was running against a political party that had nominated a really unpopular candidate. And so I'm not sure he would have had the kind of support that he did if he hadn't been running against the person that he was running against. But he wins the Brazilian presidency. And what's interesting is there's now been a study done of like, who are the people who voted for Bolsonaro? I wish there was such a study in the US, but there hasn't been yet. So there was a group of political scientists who said, well, who would vote for, because Bolsonaro, he's been called Trump of the tropics. So he said everything that politicians shouldn't say. Like before he was elected, it was really clear that he was not really absorbing the general conventions that you would expect a president of a constitutional democracy to follow. And yet people voted for him. So what these political scientists showed was that of the people, if you ask people, do you think democracy is a good system for running government? It turns out there's always some people who say no. That's about 20% of the public in Brazil. It's about 25 to 30% in the US, actually. So of the 20% who think democracy is a bad idea, 80% of them voted for Bolsonaro. But that's not enough to win an election. What they found was that of the people who were committed to democracy, most of the people who voted for Bolsonaro kept saying, but we need a radical change. Like things aren't going well. And yes, democracy really matters, but if we have to break some eggs, we have to do it. Right. So this is really important about some of these coalitions. It's not that voters want to give up democracy, it's that they're dissatisfied with democracy as they find it. So Bolsonaro comes to office and he says a lot of offensive things. So I'm in favor of torture, you know that, but if we don't like bang some heads, we never get anything done. Or then he says, this woman deserved to be raped because she's ugly. He said, things will change. We need a civil war. And we have to do some things that the military regime that governed Brazil, before the 80s didn't do. Maybe we need to kill like 30,000 people. Some innocents will die. It's okay. I mean, he's saying stuff like this all the time. But what's interesting about Bolsonaro, in contrast with Putin and Orban, he doesn't change the law much. He just is uninterested in law. So he fires people he doesn't like. He doesn't fill government positions that need to be filled. He sort of lets departments kind of die rather than fill them with people. And when problems come up, he decides it's none of his business to solve them. In other words, he likes the stage, but he doesn't like governing. So for example, when COVID hit Brazil was one of the hardest hit countries. Bolsonaro denied the virus was real. He refused to do anything. He even tried to block governors, Brazil's a federal system, from doing anything, but the courts actually stopped him. He touted fake cures. He refused to wear a mask. He himself caught it, and then he came out saying, you see, real men can handle this. And what was interesting was that because he had not yet tried to capture the parliament, tried to capture the courts, he had not done all this legal infrastructural stuff, the courts were still around to stop him. He tried to impeach a couple of the judges. The parliament said nothing, The judiciary kept him in check. The judiciary he didn't always follow the decisions, but the judiciary was out there empowering the governors to do something. One of the judgments actually made Bolsonaro wear a mask in public, which, as you can see, he was not always completely compliant with. But still, because he had not acted in this legal fashion, he didn't really lock down his power. Brazil, unfortunately, in COVID during the epidemic, had one of the highest death rates in the world next to the US, and just in terms of absolute numbers. And through that, Bolsonaro was blaming everybody else and saying, what do you expect? Like you didn't hire he puts a military guy in charge of the public health service who's a little clueless about what's happening. All of that stuff was like performative presidency, but he wasn't actually solving any problems. What's interesting, though, is when he ran for president last year, he came amazingly close to winning again. Okay. But he was beaten by his Lula da Silva, his longtime rival. And Lula da Silva was allowed to run because Bolsonaro's people had actually prosecuted Lula for corruption, which Lula might well have done. But because there were so many prosecutorial errors, Lula was finally, let out of prison because of the prosecutorial overreach, and then Lula ran against him. Again, he's a mixed candidate, but still someone who had a base. And what I keep asking about last year's election was what would have happened if Bolsonaro had been a better lawyer or had a team of lawyers? If he had changed the election law, this was really, you can change the election law to overcome that kind of gap. What if he had actually succeeded in impeaching some of the Supreme Court judges? What if his party had been more popular in the parliament? Okay, after the election, the story, Bolsonaro refuses to recognize defeat. And he also refuses to participate in the inauguration ceremony of his successor. So this is him landing on December 31st of New Year's Eve in Orlando, Florida, so that he won't participate in handing the presidential sash to his successor. On January 3rd, his successor was inaugurated as president, promising a return to democracy. And then a couple of days ago, there was this, which is his supporters came out. They thought they could bring out the military because Bolsonaro had had a career in the military. They thought they could bring out the military and overthrow the government. This is them attacking the parliament building. They also trashed the Supreme Court. They also trashed the presidential palace. By trashed, I mean they went in and literally broke all the furniture anyway, it's pretty terrible. What's interesting though is that all the powers, including people from Lula's party in the parliament, united and said, this is not how we act as a democracy. And they've come together, they've actually fired some of the state officials who seem to have been in cahoots with the protesters, and they're putting up a united front. It's like a renewal of democracy in Brazil, precisely because Bolsonaro didn't do this lockdown. And we call this, David Posen and I published a piece on this last year, in which we call this executive underreach. We have a lot of constitutional protections for what happens if a president overreaches, tries to do too much. But one of the problems is that we don't have enough to kind of make a president act if he refuses to act. And this was sort of the case here. So I finally come to the United States. So where are we? These were a couple of covers of magazines right after the election of Donald Trump. I don't know if you ever saw this New Yorker cover. The other one is from Der Spiegel, a German periodical. It says the end of the world. There was a real shock when Donald Trump was elected in the United States. But we shouldn't have been very surprised. This is the result of Gallup polls going back to the early 70s, asking, on a whole, would you say you're satisfied or dissatisfied with the way the nation is being governed? And what's striking about this, and what's also very, you find this in other failing democracies, is that basically since 9/11, majorities, including huge majorities of the American public, are dissatisfied with the way the nation is being governed. And this is true no matter who's president. So this goes through George Bush, this goes through Obama, this goes through Trump. Oh, this is not quite Trump yet, but if you extended the timeline out, it would still be the same. So it's not responding to who's in the presidency. And in fact, the democracy rankings for the US had been declining before Trump came into power. This is not something new. Between 2010 and 2020, the US was one of what Freedom House calls top 25 decliners, like the number of points down the scale the country had gone, in the top 25 in the world. The decline was much faster after Trump came in, but it did not start there. This is another Varieties of Democracy indicator looking at executive respect for the Constitution. And in the Trump years, it fell to the lowest score that it had been in the post-war period. The other two little blips there, there's a, whoops, got two different things here. There's one blip here, this is Watergate, then there's this War on Terror blip, and then there's this blip. But note that a perfect score is 4. The executive respects the Constitution, and the US has not been there, since this started being collected. Which is to say that the US already had its problems long before Trump came in. Now, Trump has a little bit of the same track record as Bolsonaro, so he was constantly saying things that got a lot of people excited. These are some of them. His criticism of John McCain, he's not a war hero, he was captured. I like people who weren't captured, or his comments about Mexico not sending the best people. or about, why don't they go back and help fix the totally broken and crime infested places from which they came, about people of color and Black Lives Matter, et cetera. So, you all will remember a lot of those comments. And Trump openly celebrated violence. So did Bolsonaro, by the way. This is just a set of comments in which Trump praised police for killing people on occasion, in which he congratulated governors who had used force. And so, again, it was a persistent refrain through the Trump years that he was interested in, advocating, praising people who had committed political violence and even sort of advocating it himself. But here's the interesting thing. Trump was totally uninterested in law, right? In this respect, he looks a lot more like Bolsonaro, right? So he's improvising policy from one day to the next. He changes his mind. He puts people into administrative positions who don't really have the traditional qualifications for those jobs. Like Bolsonaro, he just refused to fill a lot of the jobs and practically closed executive departments down, refuses expert advice. You might recall, remember the government shutdown for 22 days that Trump, you could have blamed either side, but Trump took credit for it. And in general, he was sort of preventing the government from functioning. There were a couple of cases like this Muslim ban that went through several revisions before being approved by the courts, his border wall emergency, but by and large, Trump was not particularly interested in law. And of course, his response to COVID was very much like Bolsonaro's. So this is really interesting, how for all the stuff that Trump did, he doesn't look like those other autocrats, right, who nail down power by law. And this is also really interesting. Trump never had majority support. His popularity is 30 to 40%. And it remained that way, and it got worse, after January 6th. But what did Trump do with the law? It's not that he did nothing. So he got that first law through Congress, remember the big tax cuts and so on that he took credit for, but mostly he issued a lot of executive orders. So he issued a lot more executive orders than either Obama or Bush before him. And a lot of these, the thing about executive orders is they can be overturned immediately by the next successor. And he had lots of proclamations and so forth. His administration rolled back a lot of regulations. They didn't put in place a lot of new ones. There was this giant flurry of that at the very end. But here's the crucial thing. In many ways, what Trump did was to do the functional equivalent of amending an unamendable constitution. And that was by changing the judges on the courts. Now, as you know, that was not something, Trump was willing to let other people do it in his name, but it wasn't the thing that Trump was advocating. This was really coming from a longstanding program of the Republican Party to nominate candidates who would overturn certain key precedents, obviously Roe being one. But the other precedents are actually quite interesting about executive power in the United States. So Trump nominated a quarter of the overall federal bench, a third of the Supreme Court, but Trump actually didn't have much to do with that. He used the courts in a sort of a novel way. His judges have been deemed significantly more conservative. There's a link to a study that has shown this, but this is where the legal change really happened. And this was not mostly Trump. Of course, like Bolsonaro, though, Trump was voted out of office. He didn't change enough of the election rules. He didn't change enough of the law to make that impossible, right? So he's changed, of course, the Electoral College vote. But Trump, like Bolsonaro, Trump before Bolsonaro, denied the legitimacy of the election, refused the peaceful transfer of power. This is a quote from September 2020, where he said, I am not going to commit to a peaceful transfer of power. Presided over the January 6th insurrection, riot, whatever you want to call it, of the Capitol. But here's the interesting thing. As the January 6th committee has kind of dug into what's happened, there's a lot more law behind the scenes than you would guess. And in particular, what you see is that the incursion into the Capitol was actually not where the main action was. The main action was this legal plot, so to speak, to use ambiguities in this old Electoral Count Act to get Congress to accept fake electors and switch the election. Which is to say, if you look at who's under investigation, if you read the January 6th committee report, the people who are under investigation are overwhelmingly lawyers. Now, let me just say one thing. Lawyers. Trump found lawyers really helpful, as he always has, when down and out, no other choice, right? But he found his lawyers. In Watergate, because you remember Watergate's one of the other dips, in the control of executive action, John Dean wrote a really interesting article pointing out that 3/4 of the people who went to jail for Watergate were lawyers. And we're seeing a kind of repeat here, which is that was the real plan. And that was the plan that might have worked. And now you see again, Republican state legislatures and Republican, attorneys general, and this case before the Supreme Court that's trying to make more possible for the next election, this so-called independent state legislature theory in which state legislatures might be able to take control of the presidential elector selection process and possibly substitute their own electors for the electors chosen by the people. There are also other theories coming down the pike. So you see election laws being changed. Here we are, Georgia at ground zero for some of that. But there's some other plans on the books. Right before Trump left office, he introduced this thing called Schedule F, a little technical, but the civil service, the US now has a long tradition of a proudly independent civil service. Whoever's elected, they obey, right? Schedule F would have allowed something like 20% of the people protected by the civil service laws to be made at-will employees, able to be fired for no reason at all. Trump did that on his last week in office. Biden reversed it, but now there's a plan to bring it back, and there are actually now people being trained to go into all these jobs that have been where the civil servants have been removed, to put in a cadre of people who have much more of a political orientation. This is already in the planning stages. And then, of course, there's the so-called unitary executive theory, which has been coming for many years, in which the idea is that you read Article 2 of the Constitution, and all it says is the president shall, all the executive power rests in the president. Unitary executive theory says all these independent agencies, all of these hybrid things appointed by Congress, and the president may or may not have firing rights, all of that is unconstitutional. All executive agencies should report directly to the president. These theories, if they went into effect, would start to look like the slow motion constitutional coup that we've seen in other places, where the goal is to give the president as much discretionary power as possible and to sideline, either get the courts and parliament to rubber stamp or to sideline. That's the danger signal. All right, so what about the US? What we're seeing now are elements of all three of those, different strategies of autocratic takeover. The slow-moving constitutional coup actually has very little to do with Trump. The independent state legislature theory, the unitary executive theory, the Schedule F, all of that stuff has been in the works for a long time, long before Trump. And in fact, if anything, Trump was a kind of fly in the ointment of all of that because he didn't have the discipline to do any of that stuff. This is something that's coming regardless of whether there's Trump or not, right? And that starts to look like the Putin consolidation of power. There's also kind of a blitz element here, both with regard to the way the Supreme Court seats were filled in a kind of irregular manner, or at least in a manner in which it's hard to reconcile that all three seats that Trump got were filled under the same rules. That starts to look like the constitutional court capture we've seen in other places. And the Schedule F, where overnight 20% of the civil service can lose its job, is another one of those kind of blitz things. But then we also see the executive underreach, where Trump looks like Bolsonaro, right? And he's sort of flailing around and just saying a lot of stuff that's getting everybody all riled up, but not actually consolidating this power. All right, so where are we? So in the US, if we're going to have democracy die, it's going to come dressed in the Constitution. You can't advocate against the Constitution openly in the US. It's too important. So it's going to come instead as theories that undermine all the checks on executive power. It's going to neutralize the courts or make them rubber stamps. It's going to neutralize the Congress or make them rubber stamps. It's going to take federalism and make it subordinate to party discipline instead of checks and balances from one set of institutions to another. And so you go back to the autocrat script. What are the things that happen when democracies die? Yes, the leaders are elected, but they dismantle checks on executive power. They make the parliament irrelevant. They capture the courts. They put their loyalists, in key positions there. They work with the media echo chamber. They harass the civil sector and opposition parties, and they rewrite the election laws. That's what to look out for. And so what I want to say in the end, it sounds like a rant against Republicans. Let me just say I come from a Republican family. I live in a Republican congressional district. I am not against Republicans. I'm not against conservatives. The real tragedy here is that the US does not have a conservative party that still believes in checks and balances and the design of the original Constitution. This is the tragedy. In a democracy, you need multiple parties that are willing to tolerate that they can lose elections, that are willing to say executives must be checked by parliaments and by courts. And so here we are at a law school, and this is really where I want to stop. This is not a rant against conservatives. If anything, conservatives are absolutely essential to this process of restoring constitutional government in the United States. A constitutional coup needs lawyers. I love talking to law schools because law faculty, law students, they can't do it without us, right? They literally can't do it without us. And so the question is, how do we train our next generation of law students? How do we rethink as law faculty what our obligations are to ensure constitutional government? And one of the things we need to do is to stop assuming that everything about the Constitution is about rights. We need to go back to checks and balances. However boring that structures course is in the first semester of constitutional law, that's where all the action is these days, in the collapse of democracy. And so we need to unite in favor of constitutional democracy across the political spectrum. This is not left-right. This is about, are you in favor of autocracy, or are you going to fight to preserve democracy? And so are we there yet? I turn it over to you. Thank you.